Hey everyone, FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here, and before we return to the quick Rui material, I thought I would take a look at some viewer questions, since it's been quite a while since I've done that, and probably next time I may get to viewer games. At any rate, it's kind of ironic, I suppose, that at least two of the questions in this viewer question series have to do with the Rui Lopez after all, and material that I've covered too. So the first one comes from Shravanches, I'm not sure how he wants to say it, or how it should be said, but essentially what he asked is this. He wants to play the open Rui Lopez with black, so I guess we'll flip this around, and his concern is about the exchange variation, and he said that, he kind of likes knight to e7, except that it can lead to perpetual check, and so he asked, well, what's a more fighting approach? And the first thing I have to do is kind of make a confession, and I don't know this perpetual line. I tried looking through the database, looking for games where this variation ends in a quick draw or some kind of repetition, and I just don't see it. So, maybe there can be a follow-up question that I can address, but as far as I can tell, this is really quite a fighting line. Now, the line where there's the known perpetual, that's, kind of a joke, is this bishop to g4 line, where you have h3, h5, c3, queen d3, takes, knight e5, bishop d6 here. Right, this has been known to be a perpetual check variation for a long, long time, and is used by people who don't want to play a real game. But knight to e7 just doesn't strike me that way at all. I don't see what the perpetual is. So play typically goes like this: knight e5, queen d4, queen h5. If the knight retreats, just queen takes e4, and I don't know that there's a perpetual there. So queen h5, g6, queen g5, bishop to g7, and now generally the knight goes back to d3. Knight f3 can be played, queen e4, rook e1, queen b4, and I think black is equal here, but again, I don't see where white can bail out with a perpetual check. Maybe it's there, but I didn't see it. And I ran the engine too, looking for 0, 0, 0 lines, and I didn't find that either. So knight to d3 is the main move. And now f5. Very aggressive approach here. e5, c5, b3. And here, black can play b6. This is a known variation as well. Bishop b2, queen g4, queen e3, knight d5. In general, black is not afraid of trading queens because his bishops are very good. Especially the light squared bishop will be great if white plays queen takes g4. It'll go to f5, threaten to take on d3. The e5 pawn could be a bit overextended. And again, it's not that black is better, but it's a very fighting game with no easy draw in sight. There was a game between Caruana and Carlsen. It was a blitz game. In fact, you can watch it online on YouTube. You can spot it easily enough. And that game went queen to g4, which might have been a novelty. Takes, knight c5, and here Caruana's up 2 pawns, but he ends up losing them with interest. Although I would say the position around here is fine for white, but it's just a very imbalanced, very complicated position to play. Maybe f4 is best. Caruana played knight a3, which is not the end of the world, but he ended up getting bled of all of his pawns soon enough, and now he's one down, and eventually he falls for some trick. But already at this point, he's worse. So material is even, but b4 and e5 are both weak, and his pieces are a bit discombobulated. So here, if he trades knights, he's just losing in the bishop ending pretty easily. So this happened, and then bishop c5, king e6, and there was nothing left to play for, and Caruana resigned. So anyway, I think knight to e7 is an excellent line to play. There's a line that I just came across very recently. That's an alternative that might be worth checking out if there is this perpetual line. So maybe bishop to e6. It's quite a rare move, but it seems to be okay. So white has two approaches from here. You can play d4, and against this, what black does is trade and then plays bishop to c4, and then c5. Generally speaking, white has played knight to b3 here, but knight f5 is the engine's first choice. Maybe there's something to be found there. But knight to b3 is the usual move, and it scores better than knight f5. So takes, bishop e2, rook e1, and now I think it's a novelty, but it's an obvious and good one. And that's castling queenside. So this position, I think, is equal. yeah, maybe rook to d2 can be considered as well, although I think black is fine there. Then the rook is a little bit clumsy on d2, even though it's preventing castling. Okay, more common is knight takes e5, and this occurred in a pretty high-level game, I think that I saw today even, in what's the event? I can't believe I'm not remembering the name of the event. Oh yeah, the European Championship. Yeah. So I remember it was a big open Swiss, and I was not associating it with the championship. Yeah, it's the European Championship, and the higher rated player I think had white, a very high rated player, and he eventually lost this. So the game, and they were following theory, continued knight to queen to d4, knight f3, queen e4, knight g5, queen f5, takes. So there's plenty of little knight pirouette where it goes to f3, to e5, to f3, to g5, and so on. But the net result is this weird position where you would think that white stands better. White's castled, black isn't. Black has double pawns on the queen side and an isolated e6 pawn. But the oddity of the situation is that black's position is pretty dynamic. So the open d file, the open f file, the bishop's going to come to d6. All of black's pieces come to really good squares, and this gives him, I think, sufficient chances. All right, so I think that's everything that I wanted to say about this particular variation of the exchange, Rui, and I'm going to move on to the next viewer question, which was also from the same person. So this was from, again, Shravan Chess, and his question was about the checkover variation, although it wasn't a specific one. So I'm not really going to offer a great deal by way of specifics. I'll just mention some of the lines along the way. So the checkover variation is this. It's also, I've seen it also called, what was it? It's not really the Moscow. Moscow is bishop to b5, although actually I think I have seen this called the Moscow somewhere. Though generally the Moscow variation, that title generally connotes the bishop to b5 check line here. Anyway, queen takes d4. All right, so from here, black has essentially a choice between two things, broadly speaking. Playing knight c6 and allowing bishop to b5, or making a move that stops bishop to b5. To wit, generally either bishop to d7 or a6. Now, in positions where black stops white from this kind of traditional attacking setup. So this is kind of the mainline setup that white is after. Right, and we'll come back to this shortly. So when black stops that, though, then what white generally tries to set up is a Monokroussos bind with c4. So here, for instance, knight c6, queen d2, g6, and here white plays either b3 or knight to c3. So knight to c3, for instance, and here black either plays knight f6 or bishop to g7 or sometimes bishop to h6. This is a very real option as well, the bishop jumping out all the way. Likewise on b3, the bishop can go to g7, which is the usual choice, but there's also, again, knight f6 and bishop to h6 once more. Okay, so that's one of the options, bishop to d7. The other main anti-option is to play a6. Again, white generally sets up the Monokroussos bind, although here there's an extra possibility, which is to play bishop to e3. And the idea here is to put the queen on b6 and hope that that you can kind of clog up black's play on the queen side. So knight c6, queen b6, takes, knight f6, knight c3. And here the kind of thing that white is hoping for, something like this. e6, castles, bishop e7, bishop to c7, and suddenly it's a pretty awkward position for black. Or at least it's, there's some discomfort to be had here. Maybe king d7 is forced, and then white can take on d6 and play e5. At least that's one kind of clear possibility. You might just play bishop back to b6 and have deprived black of castling privileges there. So this is an unpleasant position for black, but he doesn't have to be quite so accommodating. So he could play knight to d7 here. This is okay. And I'm not sure if bishop to c7 works here. I suspect the bishop may just find itself trapped. So it usually just jumps back to e3. But then, okay, the idea is to play knight to d5. So black can play e6, white castles, and again hopes to have some pressure against the pawn on d6. Perhaps the best move here is bishop to g4. All right, so this gets the bishop out first. So then on knight to d7, bishop c7 is completely ridiculous on account of rook to c8. So here, white could castle or play bishop e2. I think castling scores better. There's not really that serious a threat to white's pawn structure that bishop e2 is required. Anyway, rook c8, castles, and then black can play either e6 or g6. They're both altogether okay. So bishop to e3 is a sideline, but it's one with some importance. c4 is the perhaps main move. Again, going for this Monokroussos bind setup, and black will typically continue with moves. Well, knight c6 is a pretty obvious continuation. Again, the queen goes to d2, although queen to e3 has been played with some success. In fact, this is scored pretty well. But let's just stick with queen d2, since this is a kind of a barrel review. So again, g6. And here, okay, again, b3 or knight c3 are the moves, and black reacts in the same way as in the bishop to d7 line, namely with knight f6, bishop h6, or bishop to g7. All right, so that's all I wanted to say about those sidelines. Now, knight c6, bishop b5, bishop d7 takes. And again, here too, black can try to kind of change the script here with b takes c6. Well, once again, white will go for the Monokroussos bind. So if he can't get what he wants, c4 is what he's up to. Here, black sometimes plays queen to b6, and this is an entirely decent move, but e5 is fine as well. Queen d3, knight f6, knight c3, let's say queen c7, and you know, it's just a game. So black's got a very nice compact center, and you know, if he could ever get d5 in, then he would be in great shape. So white's going to try to keep black restrained. Black is going to try to you know, kind of put the fire out with white's hopes for an initiative, and hope that his bishop pair and slightly bigger center in the long run may pay off. Now, white's going to look for breaks like c5 or b4, b5, trying to you know, prevent this center from just stabilizing in some very nice, pleasant way. All right, so that's another line. Bishop takes c6 is the most common move. And now if white plays c4, just going for the Monokroussos bind at all costs, it's reasonable. Black could play knight f6, knight c3, and then either fianchetto or play e6. So, for example, g6, castles, bishop g7, queen d3, and the knight goes to d4. This is one kind of typical way to play. You know, white's given up the second bishop, but that light-squared bishop is often not especially good in a Monokroussos bind setup anyway, with the pawns on c4 and e4 severely limiting its scope. So it's not the end of the world. Certainly white has chances here. And if e6, then something like this is quite playable. And now white can choose between a4, trying to keep black bottled up and prevent the b5 advance, or something like queen to d3. Again, clearing d4 for the knight, which is an idea we've seen already and will likely see again. I do want to mention one other very interesting possibility, though, after c4, and that's the move f5, which looks just gruesome at first sight, but in fact it's a pretty good move. So it breaks up the bind. Of course, the bishop on c6 is a very dangerous piece. I mean, it's an unopposed bishop. So this is a move that you should know if you're white and you choose to play c4. It's very important. Okay, finally the main line is knight c3, knight f6, bishop g5, e6, castles, bishop e7. And here, the main move is rook h to e1, but queen to d3 is also possible. Again, clearing d4 for the knight to go there. And then white often plays moves like f4, sometimes queen to g3, and going for e5. So that's one point. The second point is that by not centralizing the h1 rook, there can be lines where black castles and then plays h6, and white can meet this with h4. And you know, if h takes g5, h takes g5, the rook's on the is on h1 on an open line. White follows up with e5, threatening queen to h7 mate, and it can work quite nicely. So that's the idea with queen to d3. Rook h to e1 is perhaps the main move, though. Let me check out the stats. Yeah, it's the more common move. Although queen to d3 scores better, for what it's worth, and they're both, again, you know, pretty common moves. Anyway, after rook h to e1, I would say the key game to study is Svidler Kasparov from Lenar's in 99. So it went castles, king to b1, and now h6. So this was a hot new idea at the time, and in fact black has scored very well here. So the game continued bishop h4, rook e8, bishop g3, pressuring the d6 pawn, d5, e5, and now Kasparov played a nice pawn sacrifice. Knight e4, so he just liquidated a bunch of stuff, and now bishop to e8. So he simply gives up the e4 pawn. But after b4, black has lots of compensation, certainly sufficient compensation for the pawn, and Kasparov went on to win this game. So this is, again, a pretty important, or I would say this is a very important line. If you play this system with white, and you play rook h to e1, you definitely need to know this h6 idea, followed by the pawn sack. All right, so let's move on to the next question then. And this was from Nushutz, who is a Class A player, and he says this: I've been sparring a computer program to help explore some new openings I'm adding to my repertoire. I reached the following position as white in the Catalan after my 25th move. White will capture the pawn on b2 as black must make luft to allow his rook off the 8th rank. White will be a pawn ahead, but black will likely have a more active rook, black will have a more active rook and should be ahead activating his king. White can likely trade the a pawn for one of black's, but that would result in the very difficult 4 versus 3 rook ending. What are your thoughts on the position? Well, the first thing I would say is just to address the kind of the easy thing, and it's that I don't really see how that exchange would be likely to take place. So I think, well, whatever the merit of a 4 versus 3 rook ending, and it's a draw if black gets one of the ideal setups. So let's say magically all these queenside pawns and black's e pawn disappear. If black can play g6 and h5, such endings are very, very drawish. But I don't really see how that's going to happen. There's no obvious candidate for this exchange. So I think it's going to stay in this 5 versus 4 format, or let's say even versus even on the king side with an extra a pawn over on the queen side. I think that's likely to endure. Well, so what are the plans here? White, I think, can't make progress really unless he brings his king over to the queen side. So I think something like rook b2, the king comes over here, maybe rook to c2 or rook to d2 to try to cut black's king off. I think that would be the way to go. Maybe black can play rook c8. So let's say let's try something like this. Maybe g5 to keep white from grabbing much space over there. Okay, rook takes b2, and now rook c8 with the idea of just going behind. So rook c1, rook a1, and rook to b1, of course, is nothing good because of rook c2, and this is way too slow. I mean, the pawn does advance fairly far, but since black's king can get there in time, I don't think this is anything special for white. So back to here, rook b2, rook c8, and I don't know what white does that's so great. So let's say king g2, rook c1, and I think black should be reasonably happy here. I suppose you could do something like rook b8 here, rook a8, but yeah, this just doesn't seem like a really worrisome possibility. Maybe black plays g4 to shut in white's king. I think black should draw, but anyway, you can mess around with it. Certainly, the theory of 3-on-3 with the passed a pawn is very well worked out. So if you look in Dvoretzky's Endgame Manual, or maybe some work by Karsten Mueller, and you should check their columns on the Chess Cafe website out as well. They've addressed that ending in quite a bit of depth. So you can have a look at that and I think extract some good lessons from there. But my guess would be that this ending should be a draw. Okay, next one. So this is from Sarsinas, and he's a Class A player, and he asks about some Schliemann analysis I did. So this is a main line in the Schliemann, one of the best tries for white, although I think black is okay. And here he notes that I only discussed castling kingside, and I go into lots of detail about that. So he says he thinks that castling queenside looks more interesting for black because it discourages white's idea of d4, which I pointed out earlier is the reason for castling kingside. So what do I think? Well, it's really strange. It's very ironic. It's let's say a mutual Zugzwang here, in that if let's say it were white to move, okay, if it's white to move here, if he plays d4, then black should castle queenside. But if he plays d3, then black should castle kingside. What's going on here? Well, here's the thing. After castling queenside, Sarsinas is completely right. This does impede the d4 advance. The problem is that white no longer wants to play d4. So d3 is in fact very good for him. And here's the reason. After rook h to e8, f4, okay, black's got a couple of moves here. The main move is bishop to d6, and this is in keeping with the usual strategy that we looked at when black castles kingside. But now, white plays queen to f2. First of all, black can't play bishop takes e5 because he's going to have problems, well, all over the place. He's got problems on the f file with the bishop on f5 and with the a7 pawn. So he's got to play king b8. All right, well now, bishop to e3. And again, there's a problem. So threatening to take on a7, so a6. And now, bishop to d4. So the misery just doesn't stop here. So the bishop found a way to get active. Now, you might remember in the lines where black castles kingside, something I noted was that it's very important for black to not allow white to play bishop to f4. If you can put the bishop on f4, white has better chances than in lines where white only gets the pawn to f4. Well, it's kind of similar here. So with the bishop on d4, again, black doesn't get to just get this nice, convenient opposite-colored bishop type of ending where white's bishop really doesn't do a whole lot. Here, if black wants that opposite-colored bishop ending, it's going to be at the cost of giving white this great dark square bishop. Note, too, that the pawn on d3 really restrains black's bishop, so black's bishop doesn't do much of anything. So after queen to f8, knight to c4, white's position is really very pleasant. And in fact, in the 5 games that are in the database from this position, white scored 4.5 out of 5. So this is not a position I would recommend for black. Now, it needs to be said that instead of bishop to d6, king to b8 was played by a very, very high-level advocate, Levon Aronian, back in 2009 in the Melody Yamber Rapid and Blitz event. So he played this against Peter Lecko. Now, that's the good news for black. The bad news is that he lost in just 6 more moves. Now, I'm sure part of it is that it was a blindfold game. At least I assume it was a blindfold game. But even before the blindfold blunder, he was in a lousy position. So he played bishop to c8, bishop to d2, b6. So here we see a different approach. Instead of playing a6, he's going to fianchetto the bishop and then play c5. But it just doesn't work out. Rook a to e1, and now Aronian played queen to e6. And this is perhaps not fantastic, but in fact white is very pleasant in any case. So queen e6, and now Lecko played f5, which is quite a good move. And what does black do? If he goes queen f6, then bishop c3, and it's not clear what he was doing. So Aronian played queen to d5, and now c4. And black is just busted here. If he plays queen d6, then there's knight f7. If, what other if is there? In the game, I think this was just blindfold. He played queen takes e5 and then rook e5 and resigned. But already here he's in trouble. Again, maybe queen d5 is not best, but white already has a huge advantage here. Probably queen e6 is not best, but white is just very, very comfortable no matter what. I just don't see this as being a good approach for black. So my strong recommendation is to avoid castling queenside. And I've experimented with that before in years past. And again, the annoying pressure on the f file was kind of a problem. When you have the rooks on d8 and e8, it looks nice, but you can't. It's very difficult to end up taking on e5 to set up that opposite-colored bishop ending because of the f file pressure, and also, as we see, pressure against the queen side. So stick to castling. You'll find your life is much simpler in that case. Okay, and then I think this is the last question. This is from Hitty, who asked about the Korchnoi Gambit against the French. So that goes like this. So it's in the Tarash, and now knight g to f3 instead of the standard move, knight to e2. Well, so what are the advantages and disadvantages? Well, the advantage of this is just that it's a very aggressive move. White is going to go and have some fun over on the king side, putting his pieces on the most aggressive squares. The drawback is that it involves a pawn sacrifice, but it's a pawn sacrifice that I think most people think is best declined. So, how does this pawn sack arise? Well, queen to b6. Black plays the thematic the thematic move to pressure white's center. Now here, white doesn't want to take on c5, because if he does, then there's bishop takes c5, hitting f2. White castles. Well, if white castles, then there's knight takes e5. And probably knight takes c5 is also pretty decent against dc. So, white castles. This is the idea really behind the gambit, or behind knight g to f3. So c takes d4, c d4, knight d4, takes, knight f3, queen b6. Well, black is up a pawn, but white's development is very nice. I mean, the bishop on d3 is great. It's unopposed. The knight from f3 can go to g5 in some cases. The bishop on c1 has an unobstructed line. And now all that's needed is for white to bring the queen into the attack, and then he's going to have just a grand old time. So, for instance, queen to a4, aiming to swing the queen over to the king side, which is often extremely useful for white when trying to attack in the French. All right. For this reason, the main move here is queen to b4, cutting the line off. So now white plays queen to c2. Okay, not really threatening to take on h7, although it can happen because g6, bishop takes g6, whips up quite an attack. So, not in the main game, but the game that this gambit is named after, black played h6. So the game Korchnoi-Udovich is the game that gives the gambit its name. But there are, in fact, I think 3 predecessors, at least that many, 3 of which I can find in the database. So Korchnoi isn't the inventor, but because he's such a high-level player, and probably also because Korchnoi is known as anything but a gambit player. He's a guy who, especially in his earlier years, would love to take gambited pawns and just defend and then win with the extra material later on, after suffering for a while. So here he offers the gambit, and he crushes Udovich in a very nice game, which I'll show you. So after h6, he played bishop to d2. Okay, now rook a to c1. In some cases, with the idea of simply taking on c8. So bishop to e7 allows bishop to d8, and of course gives the hope of castling. Well, here comes the queen again, though. b4 is covered, so black cannot play queen to b4, cutting the queen off from the king side. So Udovich just goes back to d8. In case you didn't notice, there's a possible threat with bishop to a5 that's lurking around. So he plays queen to d8, and now Korchnoi just kind of gift wraps him here. Rook c2, king f8. If he castles, then queen to g4 is very unpleasant. So king f8, rook f to c8, f to c1, knight b6, queen g4, bishop d7, bishop a5, keeping him tied up. Rook c8, takes, and now bishop to b4. So he's black is weak on the dark squares, so white is happy to trade off the dark squared bishops. g6, and now a nice little tactic, queen h4. Bishop takes b4 is impossible because it hangs the queen. Bishop takes h4 hangs the king, so that's even less possible. So g5, but now, well, more tricks. Knight takes g5, and now if bishop takes b4, knight takes e6 check wins black's queen. So Udovich brought the king back to e8, but now bishop to b5 check, bishop d7, knight takes e6, so a hammer blow here, fe6, queen h5, king f8, rook c3, threatening a very quick mate, rook h7, queen g6, rook g7, queen h6. Now the threat is to play queen h8 check, followed by rook to f3 check, regardless of what black does after queen h8. So bishop takes b4, and now rook to g3, and here Udovich threw in the towel because after queen to e7, queen h8 check, king f7, rook takes g7 is checkmate. So a very nice game by Korchnoi, and this is the kind of thing that white is hoping for in this variation. Well, let's go back and mention some alternatives along the way. So here, as I noted, Udovich played h6. Better is queen to c5, and this is the main move. Again, driving the queen away, so white brings the queen to e2. But what white has gained out of this is the chance to gain some tempi later with bishop to e3 and maybe rook a to c1. Alright, going back a bit, I'll note also that white has an alternative here. Queen to e2 immediately was played in the game Gopal against Wang Hao in Sarajevo in 2010, eventually drawn. But it's played in other games as well. That's just a high-level example. And it went h6, and here rook to b1. I'm not sure if that's at all necessary. Well, the idea is to to play bishop to e3, and in case of knight c5 to have b4. That's kind of the idea. So knight c5, bishop e3, queen d8, check. Here, rook f to c1, a6, takes, and white certainly has compensation here for the pawn. As I said, it ended up drawn, but maybe white is okay here. Wang Hao with black is a considerably higher rated player than Gopal, so perhaps it's a good sign for white. At any rate, that's an alternative. Now, black does not have to accept this gambit. So going back here, for instance, instead of c takes d4 and then taking everything on d4, black can play g6, among other things. I believe g6 was recommended by John Watson in one of his Play the French books. Or maybe it was c takes d4, and now g6. So I don't recall, but I think at one of these spots, Watson recommended that, or suggested it as a possibility. In recent times, Ruslan Ponomarev has met this gambit with f6, with okay results. So he drew with Svidler, he drew with Caruana, and he lost to Carlsen, but I don't understand what happened there. So, and for all I know, that even occurred in a blitz game. But the score leaves off after 23 moves with the position even. So anyway, let me continue and show you what happened in those games. So takes, castles, takes. This happened in all three of the relatively recent Ponomarev games from Moscow 2010. Again, this might have been the Blitz World Championship, but he did all right. So Svidler played knight takes d4 against him, and that game continued like this. So white has this blockading knight here, but it's only one good piece. It's not enough to win the game. Black's pieces are all okay. He's got a nice big center, and it's hard to see how white really makes something happen. So we swap these guys off and put the knight back, but black is fine, has no real weaknesses, and held the position, eventually drawing. So it was a 58 move game, but I think black is okay here. Alright, back to here. The other two games continued with c takes d4. So bishop to d6, rook e1, castles, knight f1, queen b6. And now Caruana played knight to g3 against him. Bishop d7, b3, a5, a3, rook a to e8. And this is kind of a typical sort of French position. I mean, the game became very much a maneuvering one. And I'll only show you a few more moves, in part because the game, while eventually drawn, well, it's very eventually drawn. So here we are on move 22, and the game was drawn in 146 moves. So we'll stop here. That'll have to do. Okay, and then finally, after queen to b6, so Caruana played knight to g3, well, Carlsen played rook to b1. But this doesn't seem to really be very fruitful. Knight to b4 looks like the absolutely correct reaction, and I think Carlsen's idea was that he's trying to fight for the dark squared blockade, and so it's okay to trade off a light squared bishop for a knight, since the knight could fight for e5. But I think black is doing great here. Bishop to d7, bishop to b5, rook a to e8, and I think black is even slightly better. And whether that's right or not, and whether or not Ponomarev made some inaccuracies in the moves we're looking at here, well, this is where the score ends, and even here the position is basically equal. Maybe white is on the verge of a tiny advantage, but it's really nothing. So I think black is alright. And I believe that the mainstream of contemporary opinion is that it's safer and quite probably better for black to simply disregard this sacrifice. It can be taken. I mean, you saw Wang Hao was a great player, 2,700 plus player, accepted it and lived to tell the tale. But he also didn't win, and it was against a low-rated player. And so I think I would feel free to play this with white if I knew that black was going to accept the gambit. This would probably be one of my main weapons against the Tarash. But black doesn't have to accept it, and I think he seems to be okay if he doesn't. Okay, so that will do it, I think. I believe that was the end of the questions du jour. Yep, it was. So as I said, next time I'll probably look at some viewer games. Maybe I'll dip my foot back into the quick Rui. We'll see, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's a viewer game show next week. All right, so that'll do it. See you guys then. Have a great week. Bye-bye.